Meeting on the crossroads where the two forbidden subjects of politics and religion intersect. This is the Sophie Scholl Roundtable. Sophie Scholl loved discussing things philosophically, especially as it related to her being a citizen in Germany during the time of the Third Reich. She and her friends appreciated depth of thought. And as they interacted with theology, philosophy, they said, we've got to take this to the level of how this affects public policy. And in doing so, it got them into a heap of trouble. So much so that she and her friends were executed because they dared to speak up. Well, we're in a situation where we're not under that kind of threat that she had, and that's why it's important for us to use our voice today so that people can be informed in ways to help them think critically and especially biblically about subjects pertaining to our country today. And James is a young man who is engaged. He thinks about these things deeply. He studies them. And we're going to be talking about the term nationalism. But first, before we do that, James, what are your plans here for the end of the summer as you move into the fall?
Well, up until recently, my education has been entirely self-taught. I was homeschooled, and through that freedom of education, I discovered my interest in politics and history, and I discovered the importance of learning about these topics. And recently, I have been accepted to Liberty University, and I plan on expanding my education officially into the realms of history and politics so that I have a better understanding of these subjects and can help hopefully broaden the knowledge of more people and in the insight of these topics and how they affect all of our lives.
And I think it's interesting you mentioned something as you were learning throughout your early teenage years, you just developed this passion for history, politics, and you discovered this about yourself. And now he's engaged, and that's why I bring him here to give him practice, to give him an opportunity, because I like what he's been studying, and I like how he presents what he's learned. So nationalism, where do you want to go with that term? When you see the word nationalism, when we're hearing the term nationalism, what does it make you think?
Well, I hate to say it, but these days, when nationalism has, for the most part, been darkened with a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
When you hear the word nationalism in American politics, in modern American politics, usually the first thing that comes to your mind is white nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism. And if you go a little bit further back, it's fascism.
Mm.
And those are true.
Mm-hmm.
Those are nationalists. And on the surface, it takes a little bit more to look into it, to really figure out the differences, because for a long time, people have used nationalism and patriotism interchangeably. And for a time they were. But as time and the concept of the nation state and the country developed and changed, especially in modern times, these terms have drifted apart. But I think it's important to define, before we say what is nationalism, I think it's important to decide what is a nation, what is a country. Because patriotism and nationalism are linked to those two terms.
Mm-hmm.
The best way I found to describe it is that nationalism is loyalty to your nation. It's devotion to your nation. And patriotism is love of your country. And there is a difference. It is a subtle difference. And they can go hand in hand or they can oppose each other. But to first of all, to what is a nation? And because it's not a country. A nation, in its broadest sense, is simply a group of people who are bound together either by common lineage, race, or cultural identity. Or even in more modern times, it's become known as a civic nationalism, is simply bound together by common principles and common beliefs above a culture or a race. And nationalism, in its most straightforward sense, is simply loyalty to that group, to your group. A country is a body, is a nation with an established state, a government. A couple of great examples of this is there are many nations, many peoples who don't have a country. In the Middle East, the Kurds, who are located all throughout the central Middle East, they don't have a country, but they are a distinct people with a distinct culture, and they are a distinct nation, and they have fought for a country throughout many decades, centuries, and these groups are all over the world, from Tibet to the First Nation people in America. These groups of people are distinct, and they hold fast to their identity of a separate nation, but that does not make them a country. And nationalism, this duty to your country, to your nation, has had a very long history. And history is important, because politics and history... I was first interested in politics, going back for one moment. My interest in politics led me to the realization that you can't really study politics if you don't study history. Because politics, the way we organize ourselves and the way we conceptualize these ideas, the way we rationalize our organizations, are directly correspondent to historical events and the environments that people have found themselves in. So the best way to understand these concepts is to look at the development of them. And nationalism developed mostly in the late 18th century, and it first arrived, as many political ideologies did, in revolutionary France. With the idea being that for the first time in human history, to organize a group of people, not under a king, but as a people bound together by a common culture, and that the state that organizes us should not be of an aristocratic elite, of not a king, but of fellow men also bound to that same culture and those same ideals. And that's a broad term, because under nationalism, it's found its way to link with many ideologies. In the early 19th century, late 19th century, in France, in Germany, in England, and much of Europe, nationalism was in many ways linked with liberalism. It was linked with this idea of that we as a people in these separate countries are not simply the property of a king. We are not simply serfs or property of a duke, but that we are a people of a nation, and that our nation should serve us, and it should be governed by us. Because it's very interesting that if you study European history, early European history of the monarchies, many monarchies were ruled by kings of foreign lineages. And if a king died without a clear heir, oftentimes that kingdom would search for a monarch from a foreign land. And the concept of a nation is that a group of people should be able to determine their own state, their own laws, and their own customs. And again, that's a broad term. And this has been used by the early liberals of liberal nationalism, as it was first coined, that we as a people, and in France and Germany and other such places, to differentiate themselves from the old kings. But it's also been used by fascists. It's been used, one of the most interesting things is that it's also been used by socialists. And it's been used by imperialists and anti-imperialists. A couple of examples of those is, for socialists, a lot of people would say, well, isn't socialism anti-nationalist? It's internet, it's global. Not necessarily.
Right.
A couple of good examples that I've discovered is that using this the base definition of nationalism, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Vietnam, was a nationalist. His goal was a sovereign republic for Vietnam, not one controlled by the French or Americans or any other foreign power, but a country based on the national identity of the Vietnamese people and self-determination for those people. Economically and socially, he was a socialist. But he still held those nationalist values. Mm-hmm. Another quick example of a social nationalist is in Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito. Mm-hmm. That country was built on, and these are almost exceptions because the general movement of socialism and communism are against the concept of the nation state. Right. But it's just interesting to see that this fundamental idea of nationalism has been used by people all over the political spectrum. And nationalism is, and which is why I would say nationalism is not inherently right-wing or left-wing or authoritarian or liberal.
Right.
It is loyalty to the nation, to the group, to your people, and not people as necessarily as a race, but as a culture, as a creed.
And it's interesting you brought up nationalism first and mentioned it as liberal, because I would say people now would consider it conservative.
It is. And to move over real quick to the difference of patriotism and how it affects modern America. Because most people in America aren't going to describe themselves as a nationalist, but most people will describe themselves as a patriot. Mm-hmm. And as stated before, nationalism is loyalty to your nation, the group of Americans. And patriotism is the love of your country. Today, there are a lot of people who probably wouldn't describe themselves as very loyal to America, loyal to the founding principles, or even the state. Mm-hmm. Most of us probably aren't far too loyal or driven by a sense of honor and duty to that country. Not to the state that currently administers this land. But many people still find a love for those principles. And I think one of the ways I was trying to understand this was a good example of, and the reason why it's often most leftists aren't going to consider themselves a nationalist is because, but many of them are still patriots. And an example is, many of them will still have a love for America. Many of them still have that respect and that belief in the ideals of the American founding, but they don't have that same sense of duty and loyalty to the interests or the current obligations of of our country. I just think back to the Vietnam War, and a good example of a difference between a nationalist and a patriot. Many of the people who protested that war loved America. Mm-hmm. Many of them were patriots, but they stood against the actions of their country, of their nation. And while others saw it as a duty to forward the goals of their country. And this is where nationalism becomes difficult, and many times people will define it as a blind devotion to your country. And that's not inherently wrong. It's not necessarily right. Because nationalism, in this sense of a blind devotion, it is loyalty. And an interesting example is Sophie Scholl, a German.
Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine an individual who loved Germany and the German people. That does not mean they loved the Third Reich.
Right.
Not necessarily a nationalist to the Third Reich, but a nationalist to Germany and the German people.
I think that's an important distinction to make, because the party at that time was the National Socialist Workers' Party. So that aspect of nationalism almost was built into the term itself. But Sophie Scholl and her friends were totally contrary to that movement, while they had a love for Germany, where they wanted to be devoted to their country and saw that devotion as being one that would undermine that current government that was in power during their time.
Yes, because nationalism, it's difficult. It's hard because it's so similar to patriotism, and it's the best way I can think of to put it simply. When you take into consideration the many different movements of nationalism, and whether or not nationalism is a positive or negative thing, because it's been used for many different terms, it's hard to see nationalism as an ideology in and of itself.
Right.
Because it really is just, it goes back to that sense of loyalty to a people. And I use people as a broad term, not as a specific race, not as a specific ethnicity. It can be. And that's the difficulty of defining the people that you are a nationalist of.
Mm-hmm.
It's like conservatism. It's like the political theory of conservatism, that it's different depending on the situation of which you find yourself, the country, the culture, and what are the foundations of that culture. Hitler was a nationalist. He was an ethno-nationalist. He was loyal to his national identity, but the national identity that he subscribed to, that he believed in, was of a Germany of pure Germanic Aryans. The nation that he believed in, that he was loyal to, was of an exclusively racial foundation. And defining the nation you are loyal to, the group that you are a part of, is key when calling yourself a nationalist. Because it's important to make that distinction.
Yeah, that's why I think nationalism is a neutral term. It depends how it's conditioned, or it depends how it's defined. And now, today, I feel like it's being used as a pejorative, as an attack word by elements of the left today against those who want to be loyal, true, dedicated to those founding principles of our nation. While also we're dealing with this element of a certain white nationalism that's out there, that's present. So it's like we've got to distinguish what we're talking about when that term nationalism is used.
Right, and that's the hardest part, because I myself would consider myself an American nationalist, and I'm proud to call myself that. But the nationalism that I believe in, the nation that I am loyal to, is the American people. And that in and of itself is a difficult thing to define and to say, because then you have to define what's an American.
And we'll get into that in the next show.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's very important. When calling yourself an American nationalist, it's imperative to understand what an American is. Because there are those who would, and getting to the white nationalists. White nationalists are loyal to an America, but a white America, believing that the definition of American and what makes someone American is not the Constitution, not the founding principles of this country, but their lineage from Northern Germanic Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
That belief that what makes us American is not your heart, it's not your soul, but it's your blood. And that is nationalism, which is the difficult part of it, is making that difference,
mm-hmm.
making that distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why most people will shun away from calling themselves a nationalist.
Mm-hmm.
Because unless you want to go into a long discussion about of clarifying yourself of I'm a nationalist, but not that kind of nationalist.
Right, which entails getting into depth about what the word is about or how the word is being used. And people, I think, today just don't want to go into that kind of depth, but would rather just use it as a word to attack their opponents.
It is. It's difficult. And I think one of the other things that's especially prominent in America, I want to go back over to the word patriot and how those two words are in a way parallel, but at the same time they have such radically different connotations to them of how we perceive them, of how nationalism is seen as a blind loyalty, as a authoritarian tool used for the suppression of foreign groups, and how we see patriotism as an inclusive and hallmark of American society. And it is. But I don't think it's exclusive to nationalism. Because a way to describe it is patriotism is a belief in an idea, a belief in a system. Patriots of America believe in the Constitution, and they believe in the foundation of this country. They believe in, and they love it. It's an important thing to understand the difference between love and loyalty, love and devotion. And it's almost like a family. You can have, within your family, you'll always love them. You'll always love those people close to you. It doesn't mean you're always going to agree with them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the way America has often been. It doesn't mean you're always going to entirely follow every decision they make. It doesn't mean you're going to openly and actively even support every decision they make. But that doesn't mean you don't love them. That doesn't mean you can't love them. You will always want the best for them, and you'll always want them to be the best they can be. And you'll always work for that. And in that sense, I think is the main difference between patriotism and nationalism. To understand that you can love your country.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make you a nationalist. But you can still be loyal. It's almost dependent on the times.
Mm-hmm.
As an American nationalist, I am loyal to the American people. I am loyal to the American ideals. I'm a patriot because I also love those ideals. And I think it also depends on the situation I find myself in, though. When America, when our government, our state, makes decisions that are very clearly against the best interest of the American people, when our current state is sending billions of dollars to foreign countries, when we have crisis at home, I have a hard time being loyal to that state. And that is the struggle of nationalism, of almost when to call yourself a nationalist and when not to. And I almost would say that nationalism is a more fluid ideology, and that it's not something that you necessarily are. I'm loyal to the American people.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make me inherently loyal to the current American administration.
Yep.
Because I see that as working against the interests of the American people. And therefore, I would say that the American administration currently is anti-nationalist.
Right. Right. Very good. I think this really brings clarification into terms that are being bantered about out there that need to be talked in ways that people clarify what they mean when the terms are being used. So glad you joined us for this edition of the Sophie Scholl Roundtable. Next time, we'll be talking about what is an American, what being an American is. All right, later.